Hello, everyone, and welcome to our mid-fiscal year update on EEOC litigation. My name is Jerry Maatman, and I'd like to introduce one of my co-speakers, Alex Karasik, my partner here at Duane Morris. Alex is very experienced in handling EEOC litigation throughout the United States, as well as large systemic cases, and he's a thought leader in this particular space. Welcome today, Alex.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I would also like to introduce one of our other panelists, Jennifer Riley. Jen is a partner in the Duane Morris's Chicago office. She is the vice chair of our workplace class action defense group. Jen is a co-author of our class action review and EEOC-Initiated litigation review. Jen has defended companies facing government enforcement actions for more than 2 decades and regularly defends EEOC pattern and practice lawsuits across the country. Welcome, Jen.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. So we're going to start our program today by hearing from Jerry. Jerry chairs the Duane Morris Class Action Defense Group. Jerry has confronted and defended the largest and most complex EEOC systemic cases filed against corporate America. This includes the largest systemic enforcement action ever brought in the history of the EEOC versus Sterling Jewelers, which Jerry defended and settled for no money. Jerry also won at the district court level and then in the Sixth Circuit, a case called EEOC versus Kaplan. That is one of the EEOC's most famous losses in a nationwide systemic case in what the Wall Street Journal called the opinion of the year. Jerry has probably handled and defended more EEOC lawsuits than any other lawyer in the country. It's a pleasure to have him on our panel today.
Thanks so much, Jen. Today's agenda is set forth on this particular slide, and we thought what we would do is take you on a tour of, so to speak, a report card for the EEOC 6 months into its fiscal year by examining what district offices around the United States have filed lawsuits and what that says about the EEOC as a unitary entity and about these district offices as independent lawsuit filers. We'll also talk about the types of suits, and then we'll compare them to the performance report of the EEOC that was newly issued, as well as its strategic enforcement program. And we think that these 5 topics will give you a good sense of what's going on at the EEOC and what you can expect in the coming months. So when we talk about this, what we're talking about is a fiscal year that goes from October 1 to September 30. So Jen, what happened in that first 6 months of this fiscal year?
Great question, Jerry. So traditionally, the EEOC completes the majority of its annual filings toward the end of its fiscal year. Up to 85% of those filings happen in August and September. So we're currently about 7 months into the current fiscal year. So the filings we're seeing now really represent a first look in terms of how the year is shaping up. And the numbers are really going to provide us a preview of what's coming and what companies can expect to see during that end of summer filing rush. We can view the EEOC's district office in enforcement activities similar to the way we view real estate. Location, location, location is all important. It's everything when it comes to analyzing the filings and the litigation trends of the EEOC. So while we often refer to and view the EEOC as a single commission, when it comes to enforcement actions, a more apt term may be a they, given that the EEOC operates through a series of district offices that vary in terms of their case types, their priority focus areas, and the number of different filings that they pursue. The most notable trend of the first 7 months of the fiscal year 2023 shows that the Charlotte district office has already filed 5 lawsuits. The Los Angeles and San Francisco district offices have each filed 12 lawsuits in fiscal year 2022. In the first half of 2023, however, there was only 1 lawsuit filed in LA and 3 then in San Francisco. Notably, Birmingham, Dallas, Memphis, those district offices have yet to file a single lawsuit in fiscal year 2023. So we can see the importance of the jurisdiction and the shift in the focus of the EEOC to locations where major companies are doing business.
Another way to look at this is by type of allegation. And in my experience in dealing with the EEOC over the last 35, 40 years, the pace of filings, as Jen had mentioned, was maybe 1/4 in the first 6 months and 3/4 in the last 6 months, and a good 80 to 90% of those in the last 4 to 5 weeks of the fiscal year. In here, what you see is more disability lawsuits filed than anything else. And the employment lawyers listening in would know that most disability cases are single plaintiff cases where the EEOC sues on behalf of John Smith. And that'll probably remain true throughout the year. And so one way to look at this is single plaintiff cases get a priority in terms of filing for the EEOC. Systemic cases that are brought upon employers by groups on behalf of groups of employees more often than not get filed towards the end of the year. And most often those are based on race or gender because they involve policies or practices that impact people in a consistent and uniform way. And that's a little bit inconsistent with just the case theory behind a disability case, because ADA issues are so individualistic as to the particular individual. One of the takeaways here that I think is important are the 4 age cases. The EEOC for years has talked about the importance of enforcing the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967, but year after year, there were very, very few filings. And the fact that there are 4 in the first 6 months is a bit of a tea leaf showing that there are going to be more age discrimination cases brought this year than in any other years. And I would suspect there are going to be some systemic cases also. So this is a pretty telling slide in terms of what's going on. And then one final note about disability cases in the coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic area, there's quite a focus on mental disabilities as well as physical disabilities, both being covered. And to the extent that mental disabilities are at issue in some of these lawsuits, it reflects the EEOC's growing concern about COVID and the reaction of employers to the COVID pandemic. Here's a bit of a donut chart showing all of those cases. I would expect that Title VII claims are going to grow. Equal Pay Act claims, hear a lot from the EEOC about equal pay. You have pay transparency statutes being passed at the state and local level, and still the federal EEOC not really in the business of bringing very many Equal Pay Act cases. Often scratch my head and wonder why that is, because those cases tend to be serious cases that can impact many people, but nonetheless, the EEOC is still not filing very many of them. So basically what we see statistically is that the filings of Title VII cases are around 59–60%, a little bit lower than fiscal year 22, on par with fiscal year 20 and 21. ADA cases have shot up a bit, 31% of the filings, but I would expect those to go down as the final months go. So you might say, well, it looks kind of the same, and maybe it is the same, but again, location, like Jen had mentioned, is all important. Next, we wanted to talk about some significant cases, and we review every case filed every day by doing a download of docket searches in all 50 states in federal and state courts, EEOC cases, of course, being brought to federal court. But there are 2 gender identity discrimination lawsuits that have been filed thus far by the EEOC. One, the Western District of New York case, which is a male-on-male workplace harassment case, and a case in the District of New Mexico that is a male-on-female case. But the case theory in both are about identity orientation in terms of sexual orientation or transgender identity. And so this is new, different. The EEOC has done it before, but seems to be placing a bit of an emphasis on it. These tend to be very, very high profile cases in the media, probably because they're unique and new and get a lot of attention in terms of their filing. I would expect you're probably going to see a few more this year. filed by the EEOC. So obviously something to keep a watch out over. Alex, what about vaccine-related litigation?
Great question, Jerry. One of the most polarizing issues in the workplace over the last few years has been vaccine mandates. And you'll find people in both camps, both for and against vaccines, that are very vocal and very passionate about their views. Employers were left in a tough spot here to juggle things such as the health and safety of their workplace, along with their employees' religious rights, and employees with disabilities who may have reasons that they don't want to get a vaccine. And ultimately, these decisions made by employers lead to some litigation. And prior to litigation, we think there's been a lot of charges filed in this space regarding employers who issued vaccine mandates. One of those charges is manifested into a lawsuit in the early part of this fiscal year involving a hospital. The lawsuit was filed in the Northern District of Georgia, and essentially the EEOC contends that the defendant terminated an employee for failing to receive the vaccination. The employee had previously requested religious exemptions in other areas from his employer in the past, and then those were granted, but this time it was not. The employee believed, based on his religious beliefs, that he didn't have to get the vaccine. And the EEOC is bringing this lawsuit alleging that the employer violated Title VII by terminating that employee. We think in the short term, there are going to be an uptick of lawsuits filed by the EEOC involving vaccine-related mandates. And as those charges have percolated through the administrative charge phase, we may see more and more of them come on legal dockets in the next few years. In the long term, these cases are going to be litmus tests. As we know from the vaccine and the COVID pandemic, there can be variants, there can be different issues with medical illnesses becoming new and evolving. And as those become new in society, and there's different types of illnesses that transform, there could be new vaccine mandates and other new medical implementations by employers. And these early cases will be the litmus tests for triers of fact in terms of how they'll deal with those lawsuits.
Jen, how about on the race discrimination front?
Thanks, Jerry. So several events involving racial justice issues over the past few years have continued to make race discrimination a priority for the EEOC. So far this fiscal year, the EEOC has filed a few notable lawsuits involving race discrimination. The first being EEOC versus First Advantage Background Services Corp. In that suit, the EEOC is alleging that the defendant used background check information to make discriminatory hiring decisions on the basis of race. A second suit is EEOC versus Bilal and Aya Subway, Inc. The EEOC filed in that case a lawsuit alleging that 3 Subway franchisees subjected employees to racial discrimination, that their owner regularly made racist statements about Black individuals and terminated workers because they were Black. The EEOC asserts in that case that this harassment was severe and pervasive, that the owner criticized traditionally Black hairstyles, and that the owner filed an employee with dreadlocks. So these filings indicate that the EEOC is going to continue to litigate race discrimination claims on a priority basis through the remainder of the fiscal year.
Jen, I had a question for you, and that is, in most years, the comparison between gender discrimination filings and race discrimination filings tend to be very close. In terms of what you've seen in the first 6 months of the fiscal year, do you have any predictions for employers as to whether or not you think more race or more gender discrimination cases will be filed by the EEOC? And I ask that because I've heard the notion that race discrimination cases in essence involve bigger verdicts, more exposure, and can be, every case is different, every case depends on the facts, but the EEOC tends to bring cases that tend to have very explosive facts and that are very dangerous, both in the court of public opinion and before juries in the courthouse. So given that sort of track record and experience the EEOC has with this current administration and the current array of EEOC leaders, what do you think the rest of 2023 is going to show for employers?
I think that's a great observation, Jerry. I expect that the remainder of the fiscal year will see additional focus on race and including on race as driving systemic cases. That's not to say the EEOC has lost focus on sex harassment and discrimination as well. A large or probably more than a third of the charges coming into the EEOC still tend to be sex-driven, sexual harassment, sexual discrimination related. And so that's also a priority for the EEOC. But as you mentioned, I think that we're apt to see race be a continued focus of litigation and in particular of systemic lawsuits.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what is called the annual performance report. This became important and in vogue after 2017, when Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee held some hearings that criticized the EEOC in terms of its performance in the courthouse, the number of sanction orders that had been entered against the EEOC, and the notion that the EEOC wasn't wisely spending the taxpayer dollars in pursuing some litigation. And the EEOC, in essence, revamped some of its public reporting to talk about its achievements and its track record. And the 2022 report issued in the beginning of the 2023 fiscal year kind of follows that template. And so what it talks about is, and I think it's important for employers to recognize, $500 million, $513.7 million recovered on behalf of victims of discrimination. And that was up from $485 million. And I think it tells you several things. One, that the EEOC is quite an aggressive litigant. And also that when you talk about employment discrimination, you're talking about issues that involve cases that sometimes can inflame a jury or result in pretty significant exposure. And certainly the EEOC uses that exposure or that danger when it negotiates with employers about the value of the case and what it wants for settlement purposes. And so you've probably read about, heard about, and experienced the notion or concept of social inflation and how verdicts are going up and how post-COVID-19 pandemic juries view the world differently than before in terms of the value of personal injuries. And certainly injuries to the rights to be free from employment discrimination are no exception to that rule. So the performance report, in essence, puts that front and center. And of course, the EEOC uses the performance report when it goes to Congress and asks for approval of its budget. And this year it got a hefty increase in its budget with the support of the Biden administration. So some people have criticized or opined that this annual performance report is a little bit of a self-interested press release that the commission uses when it goes to Congress and asks for its increase in budgets. But be that as it may, I think the other important number here is the number of new discrimination charges, a 20% jump compared to the year before. You know, some people have said, well, during the pandemic, people were at home or working remotely, and when they're alone or working remotely, kind of hard to interact with other humans and engage in behavior that might violate the rights of people. But certainly one can violate Title VII through email, through phone calls, virtually. And so I don't really buy into that opinion that charges were down. I think it more had to do maybe with businesses being shuttered or closed or workers not working than it was that they were remote. But as people come back to work and offices are filling up, I would expect those charges to go up. The last number that's important is the 91 lawsuits filed by the EEOC. Remember, the EEOC picks out cases, typically cases worth lots of money, cases against industry leaders, cases that involve important issues, cases that present a factual record where the EEOC tries to establish new law, and it picks and chooses the charges that are filed before it in the district offices to launch those lawsuits. Way back when, seems like ancient history, during the Bush administration, a Republican administration, there were 400 to 500 lawsuits filed per year. Last few years, it's been anywhere from 90 to 150. My sense is anecdotally this year, it's probably going to hit 120, 130, 150. It's going to be higher certainly than the year before. There are various reasons for that we'll talk about, but I would expect that employers are going to get hit with more of these cases in the latter part of 2023 fiscal year than last year. And I've always been a proponent of the view that when you litigate with the federal government, that's a very difficult proposition. It's somewhat like holding a tiger by the tail, because the federal government's not encumbered by economic factors that maybe a private plaintiff's lawyer would, where they're going to get a third of the settlement. The EEOC gets nothing out of cases that it brings, doesn't even get attorney's fees, so it truly litigates in the public interest.
Great. Let's look for a minute at the EEOC's strategic enforcement plan. So while the draft plan has been released only for public comment and is not yet final, it gives us a nice preview of some subjects that are going to squarely be on the EEOC's radar for the next 4 years. The first is discrimination in hiring due to the use of artificial intelligence in the employment decision process. Alex is going to elaborate on that one in a moment. The second is preventing and remedying systemic harassment, which continues to be one of these cornerstone priorities for the Commission. The third is equal pay obligations. In that sense, transparency seems to be an evolving component of that priority. So this is about the 10th year in a row we've seen equal pay identified as a priority, but we've yet to really see more than a few cases brought in this area. As Jerry mentioned earlier, though, as pay transparency requirements at the state and local level continue to come into shape and take effect, we could see a change in the playing field here and a growth in enforcement activity in this area. Fourth, emerging areas. So in regard to emerging issues, the plan reflects discrimination influenced by local, national, and global events, such as pandemic-related discrimination, incidents of discrimination and harassment that target racial or religious groups. The plan continues to talk about protecting vulnerable workers, such as migrant workers, disabled persons, older persons, and LGBTQ individuals. And finally, the plan notes a focus on policies and practices that might limit substantive rights or otherwise discourage individuals from exercising their rights under employment discrimination statutes or from getting involved in the EEOC's own investigative or enforcement efforts. So for instance, this priority includes practices that might deter or prohibit the filing of charges with the EEOC or the cooperation in EEOC investigations or litigation. Alex, do you want to talk about that first priority that I mentioned?
Sure, Jen, thank you. And as the EEOC has made clear, the use of artificial intelligence is one of its top strategic priorities, in particular, how the algorithmic fairness plays a role in employment decisions. In addition to providing AI training into systemic enforcement teams and field offices, in the last fiscal year, the EEOC hosted 24 AI and algorithmic fairness outreach events that was reached by over 1,200 attendees. So the EEOC is getting out in the field and making clear that this is one of its top priorities. And in fact, in the early part of this fiscal year, there was already a lawsuit filing in this area, and we anticipate there will be more. The EEOC also prepared 2 ADA related guidances, which are important relative to the use of artificial intelligence. So companies around the country and around the world are thinking about ways to incorporate artificial intelligence into their businesses to streamline their processes. And one of the ways they can do that is through the hiring process and the evaluation process. And companies that do use AI in onboarding, hiring, evaluation, and promotional type decisions need to pay close attention to the impacts of the decisions that are being made by the AI. There's no set procedure for the types of claims that could arise out of this technology, but the EEOC will probably be carefully monitoring the impact it has on various demographics. Employers need to pay attention as well if they're going to implement this technology, and this is something that's going to be viewed as a bipartisan and evolving issue as this AI technology emerges.
Let's go back to systemic discrimination for a minute. So the EEOC commissioners appointed by different presidential administrations have taken varying approaches to tackling discrimination on a systemic level. When we say systemic discrimination, we're of course talking about those cases that allege widespread discriminatory practices at a company against a large defined group of individuals. So in brief here, once the 5th commissioner and the new general counsel are in place at the commission, which could happen any day, likely this spring or summer, we're likely to see a renewed focus and more filings and a huge uptick in these types of cases in litigation in this area. The next priority let's talk about quickly is advancing racial justice. So we touched on this earlier. In fiscal year 2022, the EEOC resolved about 18 lawsuits alleging race or national origin discrimination. Those 18 lawsuits brought in or totaled approximately $4.6 million in settlement relief, which benefited almost 300 individuals. So that reflects this sort of continued focus on racial justice as a priority. 9 of the 13 systemic lawsuits that the EEOC's filed in fiscal year 2022 continuing into 23 include claims of race or national origin discrimination. So these numbers are continuing to show us these tea leaves in terms of this being a priority focus for the EEOC.
So what are the takeaways here? I think several. Bigger budget than last year, more money being funneled into litigation, more lawsuits probably in the first 6 months than before, a prediction that you're going to have more throughout the remainder of 2023. There are going to be systemic cases brought on gender, age, race theories, and you're going to have a new complement of leadership that fills out the Biden administration's vision of what the EEOC should be about in terms of championing the rights of employees under these anti-discrimination statutes. So I think if I'm an employer, and the takeaway would be that I need to be very solid on my HR administration. I need to view every EEOC charge as something that's very important that I need to address, defend vigorously, and resolve if there are any issues with it, because I don't want it to leak into the court system in terms of the EEOC picking it up and filing a lawsuit.
There are a few quick updates we wanted to share in regards to EEOC leadership. President Biden's nominee to fill the open commissioner spot, Kalpana Kodagal of the Cohen-Milstein law firm, which is a prestigious and highly respected plaintiff side civil rights firm, is expected to be confirmed by the Senate in the coming weeks. In addition, Carla Gilbride, a senior attorney from Public Justice, which is a national nonprofit legal advocacy organization, is also likely to be confirmed as the EEOC's new general counsel. And history suggests that with new commissioners and new general counsels, that can play a role in the types and sizes of cases being filed by the EEOC. So all of our listeners should stay tuned and see the impact on that. And finally, we also wanted to share with you that our firm has come out with the EEOC Litigation Review 2023 publication. This analyzes the EEOC's enforcement lawsuit filings in 2022 and the significant legal decisions that were made by the commission in regards to those strategic priorities that we discussed today. This ebook is fully searchable and accessible from any device, so you can get it in paper copy, you can get it electronically, however you prefer, and we hope that you'll enjoy reading it and find it helpful. And with that, I'll turn this over to Jerry for our concluding remarks.
Well, I wanted to say thank you for all of our attendees today. We promise to get you through a tour of the EEOC world in 30 minutes, and we're right at the bewitching hour. There have been a few questions from around the country from our attendees, so we'll answer those by phone calls and emails, but we want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Hope you subscribe to our books and our blog posts, and thank you very much, and have a wonderful afternoon and evening. Take good care.